All right, so we're kicking off Esther this morning. Last week we had our fall kickoff. We took a look at what it means to be jars of clay, to kind of be, faced with that reality that we are frail, we are imperfect, we are weak in many ways, just simply because we're human. But yet through that weakness, God uses us. In that weakness, God has put this treasure inside of us as His gospel, and He works through us and uses our weakness to bring glory to Himself. And in the story of Esther, there's a lot of desire, a lot of pursuit of glory and of majesty, of attention, of power, of authority and control over various aspects of life that we see. It comes up over and over again in the book of Esther. We're going to deal with that. We're going to wrestle with that. We're going to take a look at that. We're going to spend 11 weeks in this story, which is actually going to take us all the way up to Thanksgiving. So I guess you could use this as sort of like your 3-month warning. If you haven't put your Christmas list together, if you haven't made your holiday plans, you got 3 months to get it done. So you got to hurry it up. There's not a whole lot of time. It's going to go fast. This is what we're going to do. We're going to spend the next 11 weeks all the way up to our Thanksgiving service looking at the story of Esther. Now, Esther is one of only 2 books in the Bible that is named after a woman, which in and of itself really makes it pretty unique. The other story is the gospel. I always want to say the gospel. See, everything is gospel to me. That's what I end up doing. Just automatically go to gospel. The other book named after a woman is the story of Ruth, which is another great story that I'm sure one day we'll spend some time in. So that in and of itself makes it rather unique in that sense, just simply because of who it's named after. Now, over the centuries, it's been an extremely challenging book. Really, it's been really challenging to Christians for a variety of reasons. A lot of things that we just haven't really known exactly what to do with when we look at the story of Esther. In fact, we have no historical record of anything being written about the book of Esther for about 800 years. So for the first 800 years, there's an 800-year period of silence. For the first 800 years of the Christian church, that nothing was said about Esther. Nothing was written about it. No attention was given to it. On the flip side of that, kind of by comparison, Esther is actually one of the most important stories to Jews. It's one that they are constantly going back to, constantly looking at. Every year they spend time digging into the story of Esther and reflecting on the lessons, reflecting on the example and the experience of the story of Esther there. John Calvin, kind of one of our theological namesakes, John Calvin said nothing about Esther. Didn't write a single thing about Esther. Martin Luther, another Reformed theologian, another kind of one of those theologians out of the Reformation. Martin Luther actually had the audacity to go so far as to say that Esther has no business being in the Christian Bible. It doesn't belong there. There's no value in the book of Esther for Christians. Just cut it out. Don't even include it. That was Martin Luther's perspective on it. What is widely recognized as the best commentary written on Esther is actually less than 15 years old. So out of all this 2,000-year history, it took us up until just in the last 15 years to get a good commentary on the book of Esther, which I think is indicative, and it does show in some ways a little bit of promise that the Christian church, we are just now starting to come into a position where we're recognizing the value of Esther for us as well as for Jews. One of the biggest challenges to studying the book of Esther, especially for Christians, is the fact that within its 10 chapters, God is not mentioned, not even once. 10 chapters, and God is never mentioned in the book of Esther. That's part of the challenge there. We don't know what to do with it. We don't know how to deal with that, or how to wrestle with that, what to take out of that. On the rare occasions that Esther is dealt with, what you usually hear is usually something along the lines of looking at Esther as an example, a story, wisdom, insight into how to deal with life, how to wrestle with life, where God often does seem absent. And that is definitely a worthy message. That's definitely a real thing that for most of us, probably all of us, we can very much connect with. Oftentimes, God doesn't seem like He's there. God seems absent in our everyday life. And Esther is oftentimes used to speak into that. But we're not going to go there. as worthy as that direction is and as much value as there is, that's not the direction that we're going to take with this story. Instead, we're going to go over the next few weeks, number of weeks, we're going to look at the book of Esther, and we're going to pull stuff out through the lens of Purim, that Jewish festival that's established by the book of Esther. We're going to take Purim, and we're going to use that as our lens, and we're going to look through that and say, this is what we as Christians, this is what we can glean from a book that some think doesn't even belong in the Bible. My prayer for the next 11 weeks is that we would all emerge from this study, emerge from Esther even more in love with our sovereign God than we already are, and that we would continue to marvel at the way in which God has and does and will continue to work out his plan for your salvation. It's the story of Esther. Let's pray a second, and then we'll look at our first section, our first set of verses. Heavenly Father, Lord, we pray that you open our ears, open our hearts, open our minds, that we may hear, that we may see, that we may be changed and transformed, equipped, empowered, encouraged, that we may worship you through its pages, Lord. That we may see you more accurately, that we may see your Son better. In Jesus' name, amen. Esther chapter 1 this morning. Esther chapter 1. Because that's always a good place to start a book, especially a story. Esther chapter 1. So this is what happened during the time of Xerxes. I'm going to stop there, and yes, I am going to be kind of like that this morning, because we just kind of have to do that. Sometimes we have to just stop. We just kind of have to set the scene, and the author of Esther starts us off by doing that. He says, this is when it happened. This is what happened during the time of Xerxes. So what's going on? We got to know what's happening in order to really get at this story. See, Esther takes place in Persia. Takes place during the reign of King Xerxes. Xerxes was the guy who went to war against Greece, and he fought those 300 Spartans at the Battle of Thermopylae. It's kind of a movie, what do they call it? 300. I've never seen it. Kind of a comic book, fictional telling of that story. But we all at least somewhat familiar with the story of these 300 Spartans going on and taking on King Xerxes, taking on the Persian Empire, and sort of holding off this beast that is Persia with just 300 men plus a few others probably. I'm sure that's probably a little bit exaggerated, as history tends to do. But I point stuff out like that. That was a real battle. I point stuff out like that because it's easy sometimes to look at, especially the Old Testament, and think, okay, this stuff, it's kind of taking place in sort of this alternate universe. But it's not. The stories of the Bible, the stories that we have here in this book, and especially the story of Esther, this is a real historical event. This happened in real history. This didn't take place in Narnia. It didn't take place in Middle Earth. This is in our world in a very real historical context with very real people. And pointing that out and recognizing that historical context, I think, makes these stories all that much more poignant. I never thought I'd use the word poignant in a sermon. Makes me sound so smart. Anyways, so if you're using your personal Bible, one of the things you might notice right there in verse 1 already is maybe your Bible doesn't say King Xerxes. Maybe it says King Ahasuerus. Sometimes some of our versions will say King Ahasuerus. See, the Bible, this is an example, I think, of the author of Esther actually being a little bit of a comedian when he uses that word King Ahasuerus. That is what the Hebrew says. The Hebrew actually says Ahasuerus instead of Xerxes. Some of our translators have come along, they've kind of cleared that up. They say, you know what, we don't know who Ahasuerus is, but we do know who Xerxes is. And we know based on other kind of, just the events in this story and what's going on and what's being talked about, that these were the same people. Well, the reason why the Hebrew author does this, one, he's telling us a little bit about how Jews tended to look at Xerxes. Because Ahasuerus is a made-up name. It's sort of a special nickname that Jews had just for Xerxes. And we don't have a direct translation, but it basically means something roughly equal to King Headache. I'm not kidding, okay? That is what Jews thought of King Xerxes. When they looked at King Xerxes, they thought, that's not King Xerxes, that's King Headache. He is just a massive headache. Xerxes was not the worst they've ever seen, not the worst they've ever experienced, but he's bad enough to get, and he's annoying enough to get a headache like King Headache, or get a nickname like King Headache. So, sometimes the Bible tends to be kind of intentionally funny in that way. And actually, Esther is written through and through, very kind of tongue-in-cheek, bringing out a lot of humor and almost making fun of and mocking the characters within its story. That's just one of the realities of the book of Esther. Time-wise, Esther takes place about 100 years after Ezra and Nehemiah. So most of the Israelites have gone back to Jerusalem. They've rebuilt the city. We're talking about a small remnant that has stayed behind in what used to be the Babylonian Empire and is now the Persian Empire. So back to Esther. This is what happened during the time of Xerxes, the Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces stretching from India to Kush. And at that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa. And in the third year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials, the military leaders of Persia and Media. The princes and the nobles of the provinces were present. So Xerxes is king in Persia. He's king over Persia. And at this time, Persia was huge. I mean, Persia was massive. Even to this day. I think I got a slide here, a picture here, to give you an idea of what it looks like. Wherever Mike disappeared to. There we go. You can't really read even the titles or anything, but the green, that's the territory of Persia. And actually by land area, that's not all that big. You have the Mediterranean way over on the, I'm going to guess it's probably your left. Oh, I could be looking at a mirror here. Mediterranean is way over on the left, and you have kind of India and Russia way over on the right. That's the extent of where Persia, where Xerxes' territory covered. But even beyond the geographical basis, Persia covered, King Xerxes, he ruled over, get this, 45% of the global population at that time. 45%. By comparison, the British Empire during the 20th century, at its height in the 20th century, the British Empire ruled over about 20% of the global population. And they were considered the global superpower in the world in the first half of the 20th century. Xerxes had direct, absolute control over 45% of the world population, the global population at that time. You can't comprehend that. A single man with that much control over that many people. You can't stand up to that. The only way you could stop Xerxes if he wanted to do something was if every single king in the known and unknown world at that time banded together to go to war with Xerxes. You know that wasn't going to happen. Xerxes had a tremendous amount of authority and control and power over the world. See, in Xerxes' mind, he wasn't a god. He wasn't just a god. He was the God. The Egyptian pharaohs, they thought they were gods. They were treated like gods. But their authority was limited to Egypt, to a very small corner of northern Africa. But Xerxes quite literally controlled the world at that time. And so, what do you do when you control that much of the world? You throw a party. That's what Xerxes does. He throws a party, and he invites the military, or he invites all his nobles and officials, the military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes and the nobles of the provinces. Not some, all. All of these people in his territory, all of these people in his kingdom. He invites them to a party. Now, at that time, the king's favorite pastime was going to war. I'm bored. I don't know what to do this week. Let's go find somebody to fight. I don't know what else to do. Let's just go start a war. I need something to do this weekend. It's a long weekend. Let's just go to war because I'm bored. That was just kind of that's what kings did at that time. That's just sort of what they did. And in order to go to war, you need nobles and you need officials to lead your armies to actually go to war. You also need nobles and officials to lead your armies, and just in case some other bored king looking for something to do that weekend decides to come in and attack you. You need those people around, but not Xerxes. Xerxes didn't need that. Xerxes pulls everybody into the capital. He says, "Now, you know what? I don't have to worry about this. All you people, everybody, come to Susa. Come to Susa because I'm going to throw a party. Come to Susa. Come and hang out over here." That is about the stupidest thing that any king could possibly do at that time. And that's what Xerxes does just because he can. Just because he has the ability. Because he's the guy who controls 45% of the world. He has nothing to worry about. There's nobody out there who could possibly pose a threat to him. The estimates are that there would have been roughly about 15,000 people at this party. The number of people that are listed would be about roughly, give or take, I don't know, maybe 2 or 3 or so, about 15,000 people at this party. So what else? Xerxes throws a party. Throws a party. What else? For a full 180 days. How long? For 180 days. How long is 180 days? Who's good at math here? 180 days. How long is that? 6 months. 6 months. 6 months. We're not talking about a weekend bash with your closest friends at Pismo Beach here. We're talking about a 15,000 person, 6 month long kegger. That's country boys speak for a party, by the way. For those of you who haven't heard that word term before. 6 months. So for a full 180 days, he displayed his vast wealth, the vast wealth of his kingdom, and the splendor and glory of his majesty. What does that sound like? Have you heard that before? There's similar kind of statements like that before. Have you heard something like that talked about in other places of the Bible? The splendor and glory of his majesty. I mean, that's how the Old Testament usually talks about God, right? Usually we hear those sort of words and that terminology applied to God. We're talking about God displaying his splendor and the glory of his majesty and the things that he does and in his people and in his actions and the way that he interacts with the world. And yet here we have a Jewish writer, a Jewish author who's talking about, who says that this is what King Xerxes, King Headache, this is what King Headache was doing. Oh, and he did this for 6 months with all of his officials. And he did it simply because he can. Simply because he can. You take into account, time for travel and preparations, and basically he left his entire kingdom completely unprotected for what was probably close to a year, maybe more. During a time where kings went to battle and went to war just out of boredom, just because they didn't have anything else to do that weekend. He didn't have to worry about it. He didn't have to worry about somebody attacking him. He didn't have to worry about dissent from within his kingdom. He didn't have to worry about some part of his kingdom deciding, you know what, I don't want to be a part of Persia anymore, so I'm just going to leave. He didn't have to worry about anything going wrong because he had that much authority and control over what went on. He could do whatever he wanted. He could do whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted, in any way that he wanted. You could try to attack him. You could try to take some of his land from him, but you weren't going to get very far. It just wasn't going to happen. And he knew it. He knew it. So the whole purpose of this party was to present himself as God and to show the world that there was no limit to his wealth and his power. The extent of his wealth, the extent of his power was so great. Quite honestly, I find myself stuck to even really adequately describe it. It's almost kind of like trying to describe God, right? It's almost like trying to describe God and God's own power and God's own authority. You just get stuck. You can just keep throwing out superlative after superlative and finding the biggest word and the most grand way and the most verbal way or verbose way to describe it, but you just can't get enough words and enough adjectives in to really get and really match what God does and what God has. And this, in many ways, is what we find ourselves when we're thinking about Xerxes. See, if we didn't know any better, we, and certainly all these ancient Persians, we would have no choice but to conclude that Xerxes was God. That is what we would logically be led to believe when we look at a description of Xerxes like what we have here. Verse 5. When these days were over, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days in the enclosed garden of the king's palace for all the people from the least to the greatest who were in the citadel of Susan. Now, everybody knows the best way to follow up the party of the millennium, a 6-month-long party of the millennium, is to throw another party, right? We all know that. We've all been there. It's just kind of common sense. That's what you do. Because that's what Xerxes did. 6-month party, and he throws another party. Because, what else am I going to do? I don't have anybody to go to war with, so I might as well just throw another party, right? Now, there's so much detail in the next couple verses we're going to read. You have to really pay attention to this stuff. I'm going to read them slowly. I'm going to read them deliberately. I'm going to try not to laugh. Feel free to laugh too if the absurdity just kind of jumps out at you for what's going on here. But, don't try to stop with it, just let it out. So these next couple verses, verse 6. The garden had hangings of white and blue linen. Now, blue was incredibly expensive and incredibly hard to produce. So white and blue linen, fastened with cords of white linen and purple material. Purple was even harder to get than blue. So these were the cords, these were the ropes made out of white and purple material to silver rings on marble pillars. Archaeologists estimate these pillars were about 80 feet tall. 80-foot tall, solid marble pillar with blue and purple linen and cloth and everything else going there. In the world at this time, you can't imagine this. You just can't do it. There were couches, get this, there were couches of gold and silver. Okay, not couches, with little jewels kind of put into them or anything like some of your couches might have. The couch itself was made out of gold and silver. This was a couch, not a wedding ring, not jewelry. This was the couch that people would sit on. So the couches were made out of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. Pavement. It's like Xerxes just kind of sitting around one day and says, I got all these diamonds and all this, mother of pearl and all this porphyry just sitting. What am I going to do with this stuff? I got all the jewelry I need. What am I going to do with this? I know, I'm going to make a sidewalk out of it. That's what he did. That's what he did. That's what was going on in this palace. This is the scene here. Wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other. This isn't Ford. We're not talking about mass-produced goblets. He's saying, no, I got so much gold. I'm going to handcraft a unique glass, a custom-made cup for every single person who's coming to this party. And that's going to be their cup. Don't worry about writing your name on a styrofoam cup when you go to somebody's house, so you can find it. All you have to do is you just have to look for your cup, and it's going to be obvious because it's custom-made just for you. Okay, so wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other. And the royal wine was abundant, not just any wine, the royal wine was abundant in keeping with the king's liberality. The richest man in the world today, the richest man in history outside of Xerxes, couldn't even dream of living anywhere close to the luxury that Xerxes lived in at this time. And he threw a party. And he invited everyone in to show off what he had, to show off what he was capable of and what he did, what he lived in. By the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink with no restrictions, for the king instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man what he wished. To drink however much wine you want. And again, this isn't the common wine. This isn't the table wine. This isn't $2 Chuck. This is the royal wine. This is Xerxes' royal wine. This is the best wine being produced anywhere in the world at this time. This is the wine that ordinarily only gets brought out for the most special of occasions. And here's Xerxes wasting it on a bunch of commoners. In an odd sort of a way, Xerxes, acting like God, he's granting, incomprehensible blessings and grace upon the people who least deserve it in many ways in his kingdom. So remember, it says, from the least to the greatest in the citadel of Susa. Those were the people at this party. And he removes all limits. It's not just, here, I'm going to give you a little bit of taste of the royal wine. So, just to kind of whet your palate and so you can kind of tease you and get a sense of what you're missing out on. No, you can come in here, you can have as much as you want. As much as you want without end. Just drink and drink and drink. And the wine is never going to run out. And there's no limit to this. Just keep on drinking. That's how much you can have for everyone at this party. Everyone has unlimited access to however much of the world's best wine they want. And they're drinking it. And don't forget, they're drinking it from their own custom-made gold goblet while lounging around on gold and silver couches and probably doing, quite honestly, unspeakable things to a floor made out of mother of pearl and diamonds. This is the scene. All because Xerxes can. Just because he can. Verse 9. Queen Vashti. Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of King Xerxes. So everything we've been talking about, double it. Double it. Because while Xerxes is doing his thing over in one part of the palace for the men, Vashti was doing the exact same thing in another part of the palace for the women. See, it's one thing to have 15,000 government officials partying together for 6 straight months underneath a single roof, but then you add in their wives and their girlfriends in another part of the palace at that exact same time. The wealth needed to support that many people. The size of the palace, if you can wrap your head around that. And don't forget, you need an army of servants to deal with all these people too. I mean, can you imagine living in a house the size of the Oakland Coliseum? Because that's about what you would need in order to put all these people in a single palace in the same place at the same time. That's what it would take. In these first 9 verses of Esther, we as the readers are being set up to see Xerxes in a certain light. See, essentially, we're getting a psychological evaluation, a psychological profile of this Persian king, of the Persian king, in the only way that the Hebrew author knows how to do it or how he could do it. Xerxes is a megalomaniac, a man who believes he is unstoppable and is intent on showing the world exactly that. He's not just a god, he is the God in the world. He alone possesses the ability to pull all of his military commanders together for 6 months and never have to worry about being attacked or by another king. He has been introduced to us as King Headache, and the extreme detail of his opulence simply reinforces that. It simply reinforces just how big of a headache he really was. He has no idea what's in store for him. He has no idea at this point what is coming. He has no idea that at this point he is about to face opposition in the near future. And he is absolutely convinced that any level of opposition is completely impossible. It's inconceivable. It can't happen. Even pointing out Xerxes' spending spree, even pointing out the fact that Xerxes' spending spree was about showing off the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty, even that carries with it a little bit of an air of futility in these verses. And that's because at the end of the day, Xerxes is still just another human being. He's still just another human being. He's a human being who epitomizes in many ways everything about our own fallen nature, our desire to control and really to be our own God, because if we're going to be completely honest with ourselves, that's something that we are constantly striving for, is to be our own gods, to be our own gods of our own life. Xerxes' pursuit of his own kingdom, unmatched by any other, it mirrors what we do. It mirrors our own pursuit of our own kingdom, in which we do not have to worry about being attacked, or have to worry about anything falling apart. But all of that speaks to a longing, really. One in which we will see plenty more as the story goes on. That longing for power, a longing for importance, a longing for control, a longing for authority in the world and in our life. See, in these first 9 verses, Xerxes is on a mission to usurp God's own power and assert his own kingdom of heaven. But Jesus is a better Xerxes. Jesus is a better Xerxes. Because see, where Xerxes attempts to assert himself as God, Jesus was revealed to us as the God, the real God. Where Xerxes seeks to exhibit his own personal kingdom of heaven and divine palace, Jesus sits upon the heavenly throne and rules over the world with royal divinity in the real kingdom of heaven. Where Xerxes enjoyed absolute authority over 45% of the world's people, Jesus, recognized or not, possesses absolute authority over 100% of the world's people. Where Xerxes sought to grow his empire through force and military domination, Jesus expands the border and the boundaries of his kingdom through love and grace and the cross. Where Xerxes calls all his people together to show off his majesty and wealth, the things that he has claimed for himself, Jesus' majesty is displayed by his willingness to invite us in and share in that wealth. Jesus is a better Xerxes, because Jesus has a better kingdom and is a better king. He has more power, more strength, more authority, more people, a bigger palace, more wealth than Xerxes could ever dream of. And rather than hoard it all for himself, he offers it freely to whoever wants it. To whoever is willing to be a citizen of his kingdom. Jesus offers something that Xerxes never could: salvation, security, and freedom. Next week, We'll see Xerxes' power and authority being threatened from within his own kingdom, from within his own palace. But Jesus' kingship, his power, his authority, his kingdom are never threatened. Despite every luxury and impression Xerxes may have of himself, he is still just an ordinary Joe looking to build his own kingdom. But as we will discover next week, there is a king, as we will discover in the coming weeks, I should say, there is a king and a kingdom greater than he who ultimately controls even Xerxes' own doings. That king is Jesus. And Jesus is a better Xerxes.